off we go. And, everybody, and that's not true, but most people, and I'm sure every single person I'm looking at today has heard of the road to Damascus. Paul on the road to Damascus. It's even entered our language. You will see writers saying, well, I had a road to Damascus experience. And it's interesting, I wanted to start this presentation by saying Paul was not converted on the road to Damascus. This is not a conversion experience. And in one sense, that's true. Because we talk about frequently in modern English usage, someone converts from one religion to another. If we mean it that way, Paul did not have a conversion experience. There's a second way of thinking about it, and that's saying, well, did he convert from one set of religious practices to another? Well, maybe a little bit. He remained a devout Jew and practiced so many of the things that he was brought up with, but he even told other Jewish Christian apostles that they should not demand all of the observances of the law among their new converts, and particularly, especially, of course, the Gentiles. And so that would be kind of a conversion, but I prefer, and most scholars I think do as well, that third version. And that was Paul converted to a new way of thinking. And, just about every scholar I've read, and they include people like N.T. Wright, the former Bishop of Durham, Paula Fredrickson, who is now a member of the humanities faculty of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the late Krister Stendahl, who was the magnificent Bishop of Stockholm and former Dean of the Harvard Divinity School, and E.P. Saunders, Professor of Religion at Duke University. All of these people are very, very well known in their field. And I think most of them would agree with the way Saunders down at Duke put it. The debate over whether or not Paul converted is actually about the meaning of the word conversion. If it means turn from the worship of one God to the worship of another, no. If it was partially converted by just giving up some practices and turning to a new way, a modified way of religious practice, well, maybe. But Saunders says, but if by conversion we mean not turn from, but only turn to, bingo. He didn't say that, I did. But that's the kind of conversion that Paul had. And what I really loved about Saunders' commentary was, I don't know whether any of you all have ever been over the years witness to academic fights among professors and scholars. And they can get really nasty. And what Saunders wrote in his book about to Paul, he says, my inclination is to use it the third way, but I wouldn't wish to fight to the death over usage. And that was such a refreshing comment from an academic who is not embroiled in a fight to the death over semantics. So how do you organize a program, a presentation like this? I decided I'd go harken back to my days in school, and I can't even remember whether it was elementary, secondary, or high school. When you write and when reporters report, the 5 W's: who, what, why, where, and when. And that's as good a construct as any as I can think to talk a little bit this morning about Paul. Some of those are slam dunk. Who? Well, Paul, duh. Where? Road to Damascus. When? 34 to 37 AD. And what? It was a blinding light in the voice of Jesus. Now we will discuss why a little bit later on. But the accounts, and you may see them on the screen now, from Acts of what happened. Paul was still, and this is what Acts says, still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, which was what early Christian Jews were called, not Christians, but just people of the way, whether they were men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. And as he neared Damascus, then it happened. There was a blinding light, and he fell down. He heard a voice, and he said, "Who are you?" And the response was, "I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go to the city, and you will be told what you must do." Well, paraphrasing, as you know, what happened. His friends, he was blinded. His friends took him to a street called Straight, to the home of a guy by the name of Judas, not, of course, Iscariot. And in the meantime, Ananias, an early follower of Jesus in Damascus, had a vision from God telling him he needed to go to Judas's house on Straight Street and lay his hands on Paul. And essentially, Ananias's response, if I can be a little irreverent, is, "You got to be kidding me. This is the guy who has been wreaking havoc upon the new church and the new people of the way in Jerusalem. I've heard all about him. You can't be serious that you want me to go there." And the Lord assured him in his vision that it would be fine, that this was what he was to do, and that Paul was being transformed or was transformed. So he did that. And we know he went, put his hands on Paul. The scales fell from his eyes. Paul stayed in Damascus preaching the word, and I think pretty much convinced people like Ananias and other followers of Jesus he was the real deal. He had changed. He had been recreated. But that wasn't good news for some of the existing Jewish community in Damascus, and they plotted to kill him. And they were going to wait at the city gates when he left and seize him and kill him. So Paul's friends, and God bless them, took him and put him in a basket and lowered him over the city walls of Damascus so he could escape. And he went to Jerusalem. Well, you know, this is getting to be a common pattern. He goes to Jerusalem, and of course, he seeks out early Christian believers. And I hate to use the word Christian because we weren't called that then. Early believers of Jesus. And they're not so sure either. You know, his reputation in Jerusalem as a zealot, which he was by his own description, and a great persecutor of the church, gave them a lot of pause. But what eventually happened was Barnabas took him under his wing and took him to the apostles, and together they convinced them that Paul had truly been recreated, that he was a different person, and that he was indeed on a mission to proclaim Jesus to anyone who would hear, and especially later on, of course, to the Gentiles. And Paul, you know, talks about his previous life in a letter to the Galatians, and it's there on your screen. And perhaps you have heard my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God. I tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb, called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son in me, to me, so that I might preach among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. He believed the word he was hearing from God, and then he began. So we haven't talked about the what yet, the final W, why? Why did this happen? Well, it's pretty obvious from what we've read in Acts. This was God talking to a man he wanted to charge with a very important mission. It was a dramatic conversion to, and not from, And it was a calling that, like almost none other we've ever heard of. Paula Fredrickson, who I mentioned earlier, wants to emphasize, and we should remember this, Paul did not convert to, quote, Christianity. Paul was a Jew, first, last, and always, to the day he died. He lived, and this is Paula Fredrickson's words, in a Jewish world incandescent with apocalyptic hopes, that God verged on realizing his ancient promises to Israel, that the Messiah had come and would soon come again, that the dead were about to be raised, and together with the living transformed, that the nations and even the nations' gods would shortly turn to worship the God of Israel, a Mediterranean world thick with ancient actors, pagans and Jews, healers and prophets, angels and demons, Greeks and Romans, and not least angry superhuman forces, divine powers, and hostile cosmic gods. This is the world that Paul lived in. And sometimes it's hard for us to understand the context because we weren't there and it was 2,000 years ago. But Paul and his convictions about the world he was living in and his revelation, he held them as a committed Jew. He enacted them as a committed Jew. He lived his life entirely within his native Judaism. And this is a quick aside. Well, first, as I'm sure you all remember, even Jesus said, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come to fulfill them." And this is precisely in keeping with Paul's understanding of the revelation he received. It didn't turn him away from his zealous, passionate devotion to God, but rather caused him to turn to a new understanding of exactly who Jesus was, the fulfillment of Paul's years of study and hope. And you all may remember, if you watched the film that we all watched some time ago about Acts of the Apostles, and I think it was, what was it called, AD 100? It was the follow-up to the series, the very popular series about Jesus. But remember how the actor, and I think he probably did a pretty good job, again, he was the same person in one respect before Damascus as he was after. In both cases, he was a zealot. He was zealous for what he believed in. And his personality traits were used to advance a new cause or a new understanding, but he didn't cease being quite zealous in his beliefs. Now, I also remember, and this is some years ago, of course, I think Ann Ritchie preached a sermon and made a comment one day. I'm probably getting it wrong, but I hope not. That really, in a way, we're all Jews. I mean, we really are a part of the Judeo, and now we call it Christian, heritage. But essentially, we are a sect of Judaism that was early called the Way, and then through years and years of transformation in terms of language, came to be called a separate religion, Christianity. But in many ways, when you think about it, we are a practicing sect of Judaism, that group of people who believe the Messiah has come and that he is the Redeemer of the world. And you know, if you ever doubted, well, was Paul's, quote, conversion or conviction about his revelation in any doubt, think about this, what he wrote in 2 Corinthians. Whatever anyone else dares to boast about, and I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? And here he's talking about Jewish Christians, what we now call Jewish Christians. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, from bandits, from my fellow Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Now, if that isn't a testimony, I don't know what is. And we have to assume that revelation on the Damascus road to Paul was as real as they ever get. Because I don't think anyone could have endured all the things that Paul endured without believing that revelation. And so here we have Paul recreated from persecutor to proponent of our Lord. And, over the days of this, preparing for this forum, truly something kept coming to my mind. On a number of occasions, it was an old gospel hymn called He Lives by A.H. Ackerley. And I want to just quote a few excerpts from it because I really think it partially captures the message that Paul was given and his beliefs as a result of that road to Damascus experience. I serve a risen Savior. He's in the world today. I know that he is living, whatever foes may say. I see his hand of mercy. I hear his voice of cheer. And just the time I need him, he's always near. Rejoice, rejoice, O Christian, lift up your voice and sing eternal hallelujahs to Jesus Christ the King. The hope of all who seek him, the help of all who find. None other is so loving, so good and kind. He lives, salvation to impart. You ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart. I think Paul could have written that. So the good news, beloved friends, at Church of the Resurrection, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, and our Redeemer lives. And you can take it from Paul because he saw him. Now, I'm going to stop right here and see, this is such an old and common story. I don't even know if you have any questions, but if you do, speak up.
I have a comment. I hadn't noticed until I heard you read the scripture in particular, Larry, how, part of God speaking to Paul on the road to Damascus was, I'm going to, he didn't use the word privilege, but I'm going to give you the privilege of suffering for me. It's like, whoa. And he did, because you read all the ways he suffered. But isn't it interesting to think about being given the privilege of suffering for Christ?
It is, and I'll ask all of you, would you pray to have that kind of vision, first of all? But secondly, would you be willing to suffer all that Paul suffered to proclaim it? It's scary. And I think we think we live in such a civilized world today. And I guess we do, but compared to centuries ago. But look at Syria and what's happening there. Look at North Korea. Really look at the suffering throughout the world. This isn't a happy place. I mean, this is in some respects. And when we go and proclaim our faith boldly, I think there are times where we would not be received very nicely. And we would be treated as radicals, as Christian nuts, one of those. It's a serious thing to think about a revelation like that and what it would do to you. We saw what it did to Paul. Now, I think we still have any more comments? We still have a few more minutes. And hi, David, do you have a comment?
You have to unmute yourself. Unmute.
Okay, yeah.
I had more of a procedural question.
Sure.
If I am a Gentile and wish to become a person of the way, do I have to become Jewish first?
Not in the sense that where you, as Paul said, you don't have to be circumcised, even though, I mean, it's a delicate topic, but guys, you know, in mid 20th century, that was the common practice in hospitals here. So, but I mean, the thought of going through that procedure as an adult, and as you know from other readings in the scriptures, Peter had the straight from heaven vision, and God telling all the creatures of the world were there, and God telling him, eat. And Peter says, I can't, it's some of that stuff's not clean. So no, we don't have to become Jewish in the sense of all of those practices, and even Paul said that. But yes, in some respects, we are already. I mean, we believe in a Messiah who was proclaimed for millennia by the Jewish religion. I mean, you take the Jewish beliefs out of Christianity, and you really don't have a whole lot left. I mean, the whole pattern of Judaism was this expected hope of a Messiah to come and to redeem. That's what it was all about. That's what Paul thought it was all about. And so, yeah, in one sense, but I mean, I don't think if you say someone comes to me, Joe comes to me, or anyone says, well, you know, you got to become a Jew first. No, not in that, not formally, not on paper, so to speak, but in your heart, yes. We believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We believe in the prophets, and we believe in Jesus Christ, who is the fulfillment of all that they talked about. Other comments?
Yes, I have a comment relative to that, and that is, I can see a sense of your position that essentially our religion is an offshoot. It's certainly an offshoot from Judaism, and it contains much of it. But it occurs to me that that as of the time it became the state religion of Rome and Byzantium, it became essentially another religion. It got organized from the top down rather than in a political sense, etc. And at that point, Christianity, I think, became a separate religion.
Ray, you're absolutely right in many respects. In fact, that's one of the complaints that you will read from some of these fabulous scholars as they discuss Paul, and that essentially through language and political events, Christianity morphed into something that was really not quite what people of the way were about. They were not a part of an established state religion. And so I think there's so much validity in what you have to say. And I think these scholars would say we kind of took some bad turns when that happened. When all of a sudden, from being the persecuted, we started persecuting. And you know, one of the things that, as I think you all know from maybe a previous forum I was privileged to give on St. John Chrysostom, I didn't bring this up in that discussion, but you know, we look today in a world where the Taliban destroys that ancient, majestic Buddha on that hillside. Well, guess what? John Chrysostom, as part of his career, went around destroying what was left of pagan temples, taking the stones and sometimes using them to build new edifices. But, you know, when you think about it, he was doing exactly in his time what the Taliban have been doing in ours. And it's a desecration of heritage, not belief, but of heritage, and trying to, I guess, rewrite history rather than to change the future. But in Christianity's progress, yes, it became something that maybe even the early followers of the way wouldn't recognize. So a very thoughtful comment, Ray. Thank you for it.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hello, Larry. I haven't looked at your face in so long, I've
Well,
almost forgotten.
Susan, it is so wonderful to see you. Susan, in fact, wrote me a note after I guess when I read the scriptures or sent her an email. She said, I thought you were gone. I thought she probably thought I'd moved to Kentucky, which I keep threatening to do. Wonderful to see you, dear.
I have a question. I find, and Barbara Bancroft's going to laugh because we have a little Bible study group here, and she and I are in it, and I always make this comment, and I've gotten to the point where we always read the readings, and I've gotten to the point where I refuse to read Paul because he is so convoluted and his sentences are so crazy. I mean, he can have a 7-line sentence and with 3,000 commas and semicolons and I don't know what all. And I'm just wondering, how did it come to what we now read?
Well, through translation, of course. I mean, what's interesting is I read a book many years ago that's fascinating in the sense of, you know, trying to determine the historical validity of some of these ancient writings. Well, there were more copies of these epistles made and of the gospel stories than of, for instance, something we were all taught in school. I believe it was Homer's Iliad. Very, very few copies of that exist anywhere. And yet we sort of take that as a valid composition by a guy more or less named Homer. But there are so many manuscripts that, and they are so similar. They've been translated, retranslated. I mean, you and I both know new NIV, NSRV, RSV, King James, you name it. And I don't know Greek. And that, by the way, this is one thing that always frustrates me. I know that I am not reading these reports in their original language, whether it's Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew. I have to trust translators to do their best. And often, and I am sure that Joe can tell us a lot about this, and Susan can tell us a lot about this. Mercy, there are countless arguments about translating certain terms in any of these languages. And often the arguments arise in terms of what presumably are valid theological questions. But I'm dodging your question a little bit because I guess I don't really know how to answer it other than I can tell you this. I may speak with the tongue of angels, but if I don't have mercy and love, I'm just a clanging cymbal. Those beautiful words from 1 Corinthians, and I think it's 13, whoever wrote that gets an A+ in terms of composition, meaning, and I just find it extraordinary.
I agree with you. It's just I find that most of Paul's writings are theological torture. I mean, they're just...
Dear God, please send a vision to Susan and open her mind to the wonderful, wonderful messages of St. Paul.
No, I
I
agree that there are gems in there, but I'm just saying, Sunday after Sunday reading Paul, I just think, Lord help us. I can't figure out half the time what he's even trying to say.
Well, work your way through it. and hey, Barbara, you keep on her. You get her to read St. Paul occasionally, and the two of you all will work that out.
She is a weak read on that subject.
Okay. Are there any other comments?
Larry, Glenn and I wanted to say that it is great to see you. We heard so many wonderful things about you from Pastor Guimont when he was staying with you. What a wonderful host you were last year. But anyhow, about the Paul saying he was a Jew to the end, probably a lot of Christians are averted by the thought, I'm not Jewish. The Jews crucified Jesus. What are you talking about? But just like Jesus was a Jew, the true Jew, and Paul was a true Jew, we are true Jews, meaning we have accepted and embraced the Messiah. And it is a blessing to be a Jewish sect called Christians. We are the Christian Jewish sect. So I think it's a blessing. We just wanted to affirm you in that.
Well, thank you. I truly, truly appreciate it. And a quick word, this pandemic is awful, but there have been blessings to it. And one of the ones I received was the great privilege of providing a place for Guimont to live and to feed him for 6 weeks until the airport at Port-au-Prince opened up, and to take him to get his COVID test to prove that he didn't have it before he got on that plane. God blessed me in a way I would have never, ever anticipated. It was a joy and a blessing to have him in my home. I miss him. I love him. Of course, we still communicate. In fact, when he got his new job, I was the one that picked him up at the airport and took him to his new home. What a joy. But as to your other comment, yes, and you were talking, one of the things too, I think people would say, this is the roots of anti-Semitism. Could probably be traced to some of the ways in which we became the ruling religion, and some of the stuff that got added on. In fact, Joe or Susan, maybe you can tell us, as I recall, the original creed we spoke had a section where it says, Jesus Christ was crucified by Pilate and the Jews, or some reference to Jewish involvement, and that was removed from our creed. It was almost an open invitation to anti-Semitic thought. And it's something we really have to be ever vigilant about.
So I'm on your wavelength, Larry. I'm with you. I feel like I'm a Jew first and a Christian. And I just want to warn you, though, not to express that view to Jewish people.
Right. No.
Because, my ex-husband is Jewish. And I heard many times people would come up to him and say that, they were Jewish too because they were Christian. And, the Jewish faith excluded Christianity. They rewrote their creed so that, Christians couldn't say it.
Right.
And it would, if you want to understand the mentality, think about if a Muslim came to you and said, I'm a Christian too. I'm just Muslim, that I'm, and you would wonder if you could be both, sort of thing. So, while we're repenting of our anti-Semitic past as Christians, and embracing Judaism for what it is, just keep in mind that Jews don't share the same view.
Oh, I know. And of course, too, as we've all read, whenever we think of Judaism or the Jews and Israel, there's a lot we're not seeing, and we maybe didn't know before. I mean, for a lot of Jews, being Jewish is a cultural thing, or it's
Yes.
even a genetic.
Yeah.
And pardon my phone, it'll stop.
We're gonna hear who it is too. If unless
Okay.
you mute yourself. Look, I muted you, so we won't know
It's
who
your
is
local
calling you.
rabbi. He's
But
calling you.
that gives Susan an opportunity because she lived in this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated, Joe, when you said, or one of you said, it's a way of life. Judaism, and pardon, I'm no expert, but Judaism is a way of life. It's a culture. It's an ethos, and that is, I feel, different than how I feel about my Christian faith and how I practice it. You know, there's guidelines, even guidelines, particularly if you're Orthodox, what you wear and what you can and cannot do on the Sabbath. So it's more than just a practice of faith, of worship service, and festivals during the year. It's a way of life. So I agree. I don't know if, I guess it's the Jewish people I know, but they would be offended, but I certainly wouldn't go to Brooklyn and go to a synagogue and say, well, I'm a priest, but I just want you to know that I'm Jewish also. So it's a slippery, so it's a tricky thing, but I know, I would think many of you, as well as myself, we were brought up in a church with Sunday school, and never once was that spoken that, well, you were Jesus, you were Jew through Jesus, you know. So again, it's how we educate, but it's sensitive. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is indeed. And of course, it's figurative in some ways to say, you know, we're Jewish because, you know, you look, I'm sure many of the people I'm looking at have had their DNA done, as have I. And let me tell you, it's hard to find any heritage of mine south of Scandinavia and England. We're talking like 95% of my DNA. British Isles, Norway, Sweden, Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic states, northern Russia.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find even a trace of a Jewish root in that DNA. And I know some people have said, some Jewish folks have said, they said, well, yeah, I'm a Jew, but I'm not devout. I don't practice. You know, I don't go to synagogue, whatever. But the Bible is our history book. And so, you know, it is indeed a very difficult, you know, narrow line to follow. And I won't pretend to say I do it very well, but
Well,
yeah.
Lou is not a Gentile. And you were
Yeah.
gonna say, Lou?
I would just say, well, let's not paint Judaism with a broad brush,
Yeah.
because there are very Orthodox sects, you might want to call them, but then my roots as a Russian Jew from way back, but then our family became very Reformed, you know, not even conservative, but very Reformed, and you know, and so and we even studied comparative religions, you know, after I graduated, got confirmed and everything. And so anyway, so some of us are Jews that have become Christian followers of Christ.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
My background is 23%. When I look up my DNA stuff, 23% Ashkenazi Jew.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I can almost say I am Jew and Christian.
Yeah.
But I think that probably is a lot of us too, isn't it? That we have that background.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was not so blessed, but I got the recessive genes in my family. My brown-eyed parents produced a blue-eyed child, and I really do think I got all those recessive Scandinavian genes, and the DNA proves it. It's just, And by the way, this is totally off the subject, but I have to share some exciting news.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have to share some exciting news with you. At the ripe old age of 72, I discovered that I did not have 26 cousins. I had 27. And I have now been in touch, Ancestry.com, with a lady named Christine Purdy, who was put up for adoption as an infant. She was the daughter of one of my aunts who became pregnant at a very early age and was an unwed mother. And it has been a joy getting to know Christine. And it's clear that she was separated from her birth family because, as we were talking the other day on the phone, she's a Roman Catholic. And all of my family are ranging from Primitive Baptist to Southern Baptist to Cooperative Baptist Fellowship now. And
Episcopal.
but it's just really wonderful to have a new cousin that I can now get acquainted with. I'm looking at the clock on my computer. It says 11:43. Do we have time to do the little meditation on Ezekiel?
Yes.
Let me tell you, I mean, this is always the case. I learn more from these things than I could ever impart. And wow, I had a blockbuster reading from N.T. Wright. Now, some people maintain, and this obviously is debatable, that he is the greatest living New Testament scholar. You know, he's a former bishop of Durham. He's now at a college in England. He has written magisterial works on Paul. I mean, they're this thick. His commentaries on Paul. He has written for the layman, like me, a biography which is much shorter and wonderful. And in this biography, boy, did I come across something interesting. Wright has studied Paul for years. And in his book, he said he's thinking maybe what was going on as Paul traveled to discuss Damascus was something having to do with a practice at the time and in subsequent years in Judaism, particularly among the well-read and the devout, was a form of meditation on a passage, the first chapter of Ezekiel. We might say a little bit more about that later because this is a dangerous passage. In fact, later on, rabbis would not allow people, I think it was under the age of 40 or 43, to read it until they were mature and ready to see it, because it is such a dangerous apocalyptic passage. But Wright wonders if, in fact, as Paul was on his way to Damascus, he was engaged, because a long trip by foot or donkey. And by the way, all of the paintings you see of Paul on Damascus, Caravaggio maybe being one of the most famous, show him on a white horse and lying on the ground. Didn't happen, probably. And it didn't say it happened in the book of Acts. It just said he was traveling. There was an assumption he was mounted, but it's very unlikely he would have been on a horse, probably a donkey. And but that aside, long trip. So here he is going along on the road to Damascus, and it is not at all unlikely that to occupy his time, he began a common meditation journey on this passage of Ezekiel. And you're going to see it on your screen, but I'm going to read it more or less. Ezekiel wrote, in my 30th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day, while I was among exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile king, which I'm not going to pronounce, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest. And there the hand of the Lord was on him. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. Remember the brilliant light of of Paul's experience. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. Their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings. The wings of one touched the wings of the other. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being, and on the right side, each had a face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out and upward, each wing touching that of the creature on either side, and each had 2 other wings covering its bodies. Each one went straight ahead. Whenever the spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with 4 faces. This was the appearance of the structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel, intersecting a wheel. They moved. They would all go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction. As the creatures went, their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the creatures moved, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. It was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. I think I just repeated myself, have I not? Next, 19th verse. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose also. Wherever the spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures as well, looked like a vault, sparkling like crystal, and awesome. And under the vault, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from that, what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down, he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. When I saw it, I fell face down. Now, do you all remember this passage? I don't. Good Lord, you're dizzy after you read it, trying to even imagine all these images that Ezekiel is telling us about. But I will tell you, Wright has a very, very interesting reflection. It is not the gospel in the sense that we use the gospel as the true story. Who knows? Wright wasn't there. But from all of his years of study, here's what Wright has said about this chapter and the possibility that Paul was meditating on it at the time of his trip. Contemplating such an awe-inspiring scene might, they hoped, and these are the Jews who use this meditation technique, bring into personal focus ahead of the long-awaited visible return of God to Jerusalem. That fusion of heaven and earth, that was the very raison d'etre of the temple itself. This wouldn't be just about one person having what we moderns call a glorious spiritual experience. A throne vision, a temple vision, would be about heaven and earth coming together. In other words, it would have to do with the long-awaited renewal of creation itself. Wright has suggested that perhaps Paul, traveling the long, hot road to Damascus, might have been practicing this kind of meditation. Here's what he says. As we reflect upon what Paul the Apostle came to say about the incident much later, it would make perfect sense to suppose that he had been meditating upon Ezekiel's vision and seeking, if he could, to glimpse for himself what the prophet has seen. Perhaps Saul was praying the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," praying it to the rhythm of his breathing, to the steady movement of the beast beneath him. Pray and watch and pray. Stay loyal to Israel's God. Stand up for his kingdom. Pray and watch. Start with the living creatures and whirling wheels. And in his meditation, perhaps ascend from there. In his mind's eye, then, he has the four-faced creatures and the wheels. He focuses on them. He sees them. He ponders them. Will he dare go further in this meditation? Upward with prayer and quickening pulse to the chariot itself. Was it his imagination? Was he actually seeing it? Were his eyes open, or was it just his heart's eyes opened to realities normally invisible? Nobody who has had that kind of experience is likely to give a scientific answer to such questions. But such questions are in any case left behind when heaven and earth are coming together. Upward again, then, to the lower parts of what seems to be a figure on the throne, some kind of human form. Saul of Tarsus, head full of scripture, heart full of zeal, raises his eyes slowly upward once more. He is seeing now, eyes wide open, conscious of being wide awake, but conscious also that there seems to be a rift in reality, a fissure in the fabric of the cosmos, and that his waking eyes are seeing things so dangerous that if he were not so prepared, so purified, so carefully devout, he would never have even dared to come this far in his meditation. Upward again, from the chest to the face, he raises his eyes to see the one he has worshiped and served all his life. And he comes face to face with Jesus of Nazareth. This moment shattered Paul's wildest dreams and at the same split second fulfilled them. This was, he saw it in that instant, the fulfillment of Israel's ancient scriptures, but also, the utter denial of the way he had been reading them up to that point. Saul had been obviously right in his devotion to the one God, but obviously wrong in his understanding of who that one God was and how his purposes would be fulfilled. He'd been absolutely right in his devotion to Israel and the Torah, but absolutely wrong in his view of Israel's vocation and identity, even in the meaning of the Torah itself. His lifelong loyalty was utterly right, but utterly misdirected. He had a zeal for God, but had not understood that what the one God was up to. Everything was now focused on the figure from whom there streamed a blinding light. The figure who now addressed Saul as master addresses a slave. The figure he recognized as the crucified Jesus of Nazareth. Heaven and earth came together in this figure. And he was commanding Saul to acknowledge this fact and reorient, recreate his entire life accordingly. This is a fascinating take on Paul's conversion. Only God and Paul know the exact substance and detail of that revelation. But N.T. Wright also points us to that interesting possibility of what Paul may have heard and seen that day on the road because of some stuff that Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians. And let me get the notes. And it's always been a curious passage. And I remember when I read it the first time, I was a little bit perplexed because Paul seemed to be talking about someone else in the third person. He said, I know a man who had this vision and was taken up into another world, essentially. And I'm doing this all by memory because I've jumbled my notes. But essentially, Paul relates, he said he saw things he couldn't talk about. And by the way, I think most scholars believe in this passage, he was speaking in the third person. It was not, he says, I know a man. Well, he was the man. And he said he doesn't know whether he was transported up into paradise or what. But what he saw then was phenomenal. So phenomenal that he couldn't talk about much of it. So given Paul's own characterization of his experience, having that vision from reading Ezekiel and meditating on it isn't really that far-fetched. So who knows? What do you think? Any comments? I've lost my mind.
Wow, no. Thank you, Larry. You're always awesome.
It certainly sounds like Revelations.
Doesn't it though?
Mhm.
Oh,
More apocalyptic. And of course, I think that's what people would probably call the first chapter of Ezekiel.
Larry, I have a question about what the scholars have to say about the Paul's feeling that Jesus was coming back.
Yes.
The immediacy of Christ's return.
This is a fabulous question. And I hope all of you heard Judy's question, because this is really the follow-up point beyond this immediate talk. And that was Paul believed Christ would come again in his day, then and there. And that did not happen. So that's something for us to ponder. Or, as I've heard some scholars say, well, it did happen because the new creation is here. Well, I guess the problem most of us have with that is, well, where are all those good things that were supposed to happen? And the lion laying down with the lamb and all, everything. It clearly, we're a troubled world and we haven't got it right just yet. But Judy, that is a point that was made by several of these scholars quite forcefully, that indeed Paul's vision of what was going to come was not completely fulfilled. The second coming did not arrive. And many people, not just Paul, thought that it was on the way and that they would see it in their lifetime. So that's another thing for us to ponder about Paul, about his vision, about the development of our faith, about the promises of God. But clearly, that's for another lecture, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thank you all. God bless all.
Thank you.
Miss you.
Bye.
You stay
Thanks,
healthy,
Larry.
stay
Good to
safe.
see you.